You look pretty tired. You going too fast?
Haro's first foray into the Pinkbike field test and one of their first reviews ever on the site. Plus, it feeds nicely into a certain comment meme. When I say BMX, you say background BMX. BMX. Is this thing on? Either way, the Saguaro has aggressive geometry, a beefy frame, and a 140mm fork. But will that be enough to keep pace with some of the full suspension bikes on this test? As the most expensive hardtail in the group, it's certainly a question worth asking. But before we get there, let's take a closer look.
We've got aggressive geometry, a beefy frame, 140mm fork. What more could you want? Perhaps some rear suspension. We've got the Haro Saguaro here, the most expensive hardtail on test.
It's got that low slung frame. It's got plenty of room for a water bottle, and you also have accessory mounts on the top tube, so you can put your tube and any other little things you want to mount there.
Yeah, there is internal cable routing, which to me seems like an odd choice for a hardtail, but there have been some provisions made to make sure those cables are quiet, especially around the chain stays of the bike. It kind of has a complicated routing path, so it doesn't move too much, but it would be maybe good to see some foam in the main triangle.
This is also the only hardtail on test, and only one of two in this entire value field test that has size-specific chainstay lengths.
Described by Daz and Kaz as stiff, chunky and stout, if you were looking for more clues of the aforementioned background, you don't have to go very far. And all these characteristics will be apparent on the climbs, just as they might open up the envelope on the descents. But what did our team think?
The stiffness of the Saguaro's frame and the relative hardness of the tires that come stock make for an overall pretty jittery ride. The bike does want to go fast and kind of feels unhappy doing anything else.
And you've got a pretty low bottom bracket and long reach. It gives it kind of a more stretched out feel. I felt more stretched out on this compared to the Marin San Quentin that we have.
Only downside to that roomy position is maybe some extra metal that comes along with it, because this bike is the heaviest hardtail on test at almost 34 pounds.
Yeah, we don't focus on weight a ton, but it is worth mentioning that. I would say even just the way that this bike climbs, it's kind of more, it almost feels like you would think an enduro bike would climb, where just climbing is more of what you're doing before you get to the descent, rather than something that's light and nimble and kind of wiggling its way around going uphill, at least for me. Compared to that San Quentin, I felt like that had a more general trail bike feel. You'd go out, ride a mix of terrain, where this definitely feels a little more skewed towards the descents. We're going to talk about this a little bit in the descending section, but as far as how easy it is to get the front end up, to do those little mid-trail wheelies or manuals, just like get the front up and over all those obstacles, it's a little bit harder. It doesn't really feel like it wants to lift super easy. So just kind of finding that weight balance is a little bit trickier on this compared to the Marin.
But then I found that to be like almost a positive in a way, where for me, being like slightly on the larger end of fit for these bikes, the front end does kind of want to lift more than I'd want on the smaller ones, where on this, because it has the longer rear center, it feels a bit more balanced for my fit.
With an undeniably aggressive stance and some serious geometry figures, this hardtail seems poised to do well when things do turn downhill. The possible downsides of that burly frame might present themselves here though, as this stiff alloy frame really does put the hard in hardtail.
That roomy fit we mentioned, it really plays into the descending characteristics of the Saguaro. Your bottom bracket is nice and low, your feet are down there, you can really carve. It has kind of just a longer, bigger presence on the trail. So if you get those higher speeds, that's when it really feels super stable. Just kind of encourages you to go faster and faster. But then you have to remember it is a hardtail, and then some things about that hardtailness that are extra hardtaily, but we'll get to those in a second.
Yeah. Taking some of the edge off the bike, we have the Z2 fork. We generally are a fan of the Z2. We have 3 of them on test here, and I would say that of the 3, this is the best example we have. There are some consistency issues that we'll touch on in the components highlights for each of the bikes with the Z2, but suffice to say that this is definitely the best of them that we've got on test.
Going back to the frame of the Saguaro, it's very stiff. Like, it's immediately noticeable when you go back to back between this and that Marin San Quentin. You know, a lot of times you do hear, hardtail aficionados talking about, oh, this one's nice and supple and this one's nice and stiff. You can just be like, oh, they're just all hardtails, but in reality, it's very, very noticeable. Like, this one I found for me was too stiff. I just thought it was too harsh in the descents, and I really didn't like the way that this bike felt. but you didn't mind that as much.
Not as much. Again, I think the bike felt best at higher speeds, and with the hardtail, it's kind of when you're like skittering over the top of stuff. I mean, certainly there were moments riding this bike where I like felt everything all at once, and that's okay. You know, it's kind of to be expected. You're riding a hardtail, but I think, yeah, compared to the San Quentin, it is a slightly harsher ride feel. Also, comparing those two bikes, I found the Saguaro was a little harder to get off the ground. I think that's mostly due to the low bottom bracket. It's just a little more planted and definitely more stable at high speed, but it's focused more on stability and like staying on the ground than it is on like jibbing off of little things.
Yeah, it's not the bike that really rewards you for trying to like pump and find backside. It just kind of wants to go straight. And almost even when you did pump this bike, it didn't push you forward the way that, again, the San Quentin felt like. The San Quentin feels like an overgrown dirt jumper, where this is almost kind of has some enduro bike characteristics. And again, if you can go fast, it can come a little bit more alive, but overall very stiff and kind of long, just goes. And again, these impressions don't really totally match the numbers on paper. If you look at the geometry numbers, and even in reality too, we did measure some of these to confirm, but you know, it's not the longest, not the slackest thing, but just feels longer and slacker and bigger than it actually is.
It has a bigger presence. I mean, like the San Quentin has a slacker head tube angle than the Saguaro, but you wouldn't necessarily intuit that on trail. I mean, there's always like discrepancies in how hardtail manufacturers measure their head tube angle, but regardless, I think because of the like higher stack, lower BB, longer reach feel, it's just a generally bigger feeling bike.
With these budget bikes, making the dollars count is very important. So how does the Haro get on? And were there any differences between any of Z2 forks? Of Z2, oh Jesus, you'll see what I mean.
As I mentioned earlier, this is the nicest Z2 fork we have on test. There's no spec difference between all three Z2s. This just happens to be the most
clicky. It's got all the clicks. Yeah, some of them don't have as many defined clicks, and then this one has all the defined clicks. Yeah, so you can just make setup a little bit easier. Like we've said in other videos, if you've been tuning in, some of them just setup can be a little more tricky because the clicks are missing for some reason. I don't know why. They still work, and you can still, out on the trail, the performance is the same. It's just the initial setup. Like,
a little more frustrating, yeah. And the damper on this one seems to have a slightly better fidelity when it comes to like tuning in, because it's just a sweep damper on the rail, so you can be like full open, full close, but between there is where you start to get some like compression damping. And I found this one was a bit easier to set up as I wanted.
This bike has the TRP slate brakes. Those work well. They've got the organic pads, so if it's really pouring rain, you're not going to have as much braking power, but I found they're totally appropriate for the bike. Good lever feel, decent ergonomics. Yeah, good solid spec.
I like the way those brakes feel. The thing I did not like as much on this bike were the tires. They're okay. I think if you live in a dry climate, they're going to be fine. Like the tread pattern is good. The sidewall construction is pretty beefy, especially compared to a lot of the other stuff we have on test here. But the rubber compound is fairly hard. I think on the wet roots and rocks we have, it was just a little skittery feeling at times. But again, like in dirt and on drier terrain, they feel pretty good.
Yeah. And then I guess the final component note, this does have the SRAM NX drivetrain. I've kind of had hit or miss experience with this one in the past, but it worked pretty well on the Saguaro. Don't really have any complaints, kind of did its job, you know, grinding up some steep stuff, no real weird misshift or anything awkward like that.
Yeah, I think NX and like all the lower tier drivetrains seem to have an easier time on hardtails just because there's less like chain growth involved in the whole system. It's, you know, essentially like a static package when it comes to like what they have to deal with. So the worse shifting quality is less apparent on a hardtail.
One of the things that comes up a lot in these Valley field tests is ergonomics, and the cheaper bikes do tend to be lacking in that department. Things aren't always where they need to be as far as your dropper post lever goes or where your shift lever goes. With the Haro, it's got a good dropper post. That lever is the one that's just, in my mind, seems like it's designed backwards. It's the one where instead of the lever curving like this, where your thumb would hit it, it curves like this in kind of a way. It's just a funny shape. I don't know, the guy that designed it might have funny thumbs.
It just makes it a little harder to use if you're getting used to mountain biking. If you're new to it, it's just gonna make the experience a little funky. The upside though is this is, I think, the longest dropper on test, and it's a nice one. So, you know, I'd say that they prioritized the more important piece there. Like I'd rather have a longer travel dropper than like a fancy lever, but still kind of funky. Also a component note, but not necessarily within the purview of this test. To me, this feels like the kind of hardtail that you would probably want to run tire inserts on, just because it does carry higher speeds. because that frame is built like an anvil, it might deal out a bit more abuse on the wheels and tires than some of the others. So just for the prospective owner, it's like one of those things that you might consider down the line. And it might even take the edge off the ride field a little bit.
Yeah, you could run some lower pressures. It is a bike where it feels like you're smashing through the rims, like you go through the frame and then you're just rim smashing because of all the force seems like it's going into that. I even, in my head, I was like, these wheels might not last that long because of how much impact. It could be because you're going faster or you're just trying to figure out how to make it feel softer, but either way, there's definitely a lot of impact happening on those rims. So yeah, inserts could be a good addition for someone in the future.
So, putting the slightly variable nature of the fork to one side, let's be optimistic. Let's assume you're going to get one of the good ones. What are the pros and cons of this bike?
Start off with the positives. I found that the geometry was pretty great for stability, for turning, for steeper terrain. It carries speed nicely, and I really did like the way this bike cornered.
And the cons for me, it's going to be the frame stiffness. Again, I keep saying it over and over and over. It's a really stiff frame. I know it's a hardtail, but it's really stiff. Yeah. And it made me not as comfortable as I could have been. So that's the biggest con, and really the main con. Otherwise, the part spec is pretty good. Those tires, a little bit softer compound would be nice, but it's on tough rims. Yeah. So yeah, overall, really stiff frame rewards a more aggressive or heavier rider, and that would be it.
And it's pink. That's another pro.
Or con, but we can put it in pro because it's a pink bike. So pro, pink, con, stiff.
Hardtail speedsters, of course then. But who else is this bike for?
In my eyes, it's for someone who wants to push a hardtail more into the realm of like what you'd be doing on a light enduro bike, for lack of better definite terms. It's a bike for going fast on trails. It's not the most playful, but it does like to carry high speeds. It feels really stable when you're doing that, and it corners really nicely. Yeah, and you need to be somebody, I think it's going to be better for a heavier rider or someone that can really push it. Like again, that frame stiffness isn't to be overlooked. I really struggled with this bike. I didn't find it to be that enjoyable. So I think you do want to be that person that's just wants a really stout, stiff hardtail rather than someone that could maybe take a little edge off with the frame.
The Haro is proof the hardcore hardtail is still alive and well, but it's also testament to why not everyone is interested in owning one. Capable and fast? Absolutely. Comfortable? Maybe not quite so much. However, any bike is always a compromise, and where that compromise lies is a personal choice.